I cover regulatory and legislative issues here. For this section, I'm going to tell you a little bit about MEEA, define energy efficiency as it's used in Michigan, discuss how energy efficiency impacts the economy, outline policymakers' impact on energy efficiency, and briefly run through building policy in the Midwest. Next slide. So the Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, or MEEA, is a nonprofit membership-based organization with over 160 members, including utilities, research institutions, governments, EE businesses, and advocacy groups. Some of our Michigan-based members include the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, DTE, Clear Result, Consumers Energy, Michigan Electric Cooperatives Association, Michigan Saves, SEAL, and Walker Miller. We at MEEA are the leading resource and champion for energy efficiency in our 13-state Midwest region, spreading the message that energy efficiency provides customer benefits as well as tremendous broader economic and environmental benefits. Next slide. So how do we support energy efficiency? MEEA does not lobby or intervene, and we don't represent the views of any one member. Instead, MEEA aims to educate and advocate, engaging policymakers as well as businesses and utilities. MEEA is bipartisan and collaborative. Not only do we engage lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, but we also bring together environmental advocates and utilities to broker solutions. Successful EE policy requires agreement and understanding from a wide array of partners. To help advance EE, MEEA positions ourselves as a resource by collecting data, analyzing legislation, and building coalitions. Next slide. So what is energy efficiency? In Michigan, the broader term is energy waste reduction, which is broken up into energy efficiency, load management, and energy conservation. Now we could go into great detail explaining the nuances between those three elements and how they fit together with demand response to create a broader demand side management portfolio. But the takeaway here is that all three of these elements work together to reduce load and save energy. All 13 of our states use slightly different wording to define efficiency. We hear conservation improvement, energy waste reduction, optimization, etc. But energy efficiency for our sake is getting the same output while using less energy. Where an act of conservation may be turning off a light bulb, an efficient action would be using a more efficient light bulb to provide the same amount of light. Energy efficiency is doing more while using less, often through cost-effective utility measures and programs. Next slide. While some people think about energy efficiency, they might just think of utility programs and the customers who partake in them. But in reality, energy efficiency is a huge industry with a multitude of players. A multifaceted set of groups impact and are impacted by energy efficiency policy and regulations. Next slide. To demonstrate the breadth of this field, this slide shows a wide array of jobs that are in the energy efficiency arena. It's easy to think of the EE workforce only as utility workers and commission staff like you, but the field is much more expansive than that. A large portion of the EE workforce is comprised of contractors and installers who install energy efficient measures like efficient HVAC units, insulation, appliances, and lighting. But also included in the EE workforce are architects designing efficient buildings, software developers creating energy-saving apps, case managers connecting you to weatherization measures, code officials ensuring your buildings are healthy and safe, and manufacturers making energy-efficient products. Next slide. Together, these jobs create a workforce of over 550,000 jobs in the Midwest, with 85,323 jobs in Michigan in energy efficiency as of last year. Michigan is a leader in the region and only trails Illinois. Next slide. This workforce, like most industries in America right now, has taken a hit from COVID. Nearly a quarter of the EE workforce in Michigan has filed for unemployment in March and April. This is due in part to the stay-at-home order restricting what work could be done, but also in part to customers being less comfortable with contractors in their homes and workplaces. While it's likely that additional unemployment claims will be filed in the coming months, the need for energy efficiency has not gone away. Now more than ever, efficiency can be useful in lessening the energy burden and customer bills in the residential, commercial, and industrial sectors. Energy efficiency should be a part of our nation's recovery, and we will need a strong and robust workforce in order for that to be possible. So the Commission's recent order, U20757, is one of the strongest in the nation in assessing customer need, particularly in under-resourced communities, and utility response. Next slide. But getting back to how we get an industry this big, before we have energy efficiency jobs or utility efficiency programs, we need policymakers and regulators to enable efficiency through legislation and regulation. In the Midwest, we have some states that have mandatory requirements for energy savings, like Michigan. Other states have set conditions and parameters for energy savings, but utility efficiency programs are voluntary and not legally mandated. Therefore, governors and legislators play important roles in forming these policies that enable and advance energy efficiency. Next slide. Here is a map showing the states that have mandated energy efficiency and the states that allow for efficiency through voluntary programs. Recently, some states in our region have repealed their EE enabling statutes. Indiana repealed their energy efficiency resource standard in 2014, and Ohio repealed theirs just last year. While we have seen some states attack the merits of efficiency, we have seen other states like Illinois, Minnesota, and Michigan that have supported efficiency through multiple rounds of legislation and have become national leaders in energy savings. Michigan's policymakers have seen the benefits of energy efficiency and recently bolstered its EE statute in 2016. Next slide. Though legislation sets the mandates and boundaries for energy efficiency, it's up to state regulators to enforce and implement EE policies, as you all are well aware. I will say, though, that it's important to note that state legislatures vary regionally with how prescriptive they are versus how much deference they give regulators. Next slide. And to close out this introduction section, I wanted to briefly highlight our building policy efforts. While building codes are not typically under the purview of state commissions, the built environment plays a huge part in our energy consumption. Efforts to reduce energy in buildings are important to state and municipal climate goals, and efficiency is a critical component to that through building codes and benchmarking. Building codes help raise the bar for all new and renovated buildings, and benchmarking and disclosure help to track energy usage and compare that usage to other buildings. Next slide. This map shows that Michigan is on the 2015 IECC code for residential buildings. So not the most recent code, but the version before that. Next slide. And this map shows that Michigan is also on the 2015 IECC code for commercial buildings. Feel free to take a closer look at these slides if you're interested to see where other states in the region are with their codes. I will also add that if you are interested in building codes and the impact on the built environment, we have a great building policy team that does a lot of work in Michigan, and there's lots of info on our website. I'll pause for questions before turning over to Nick for the next section.
Great, thanks, Maddie. Focusing in the chat box, or just feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions as we go. We have a few of these sections where we'll be pausing periodically, and so there should be opportunity for you to chime in if something comes up. But without any questions, I'll move forward. So moving to energy efficiency basics, I'm going to work with some terminology, program design, estimating savings, and utility business model. And as we go through different sections of this presentation today, what we're getting at is energy efficiency's value as a resource. And in order to develop that resource, we need the building blocks, and we need to understand how these programs come together to generate energy savings in a way that can be utilized by you in your analyses, as well as utilities in developing a resource for customers and for long-term energy planning. So starting with some of the basics and the building blocks. I'm sure you're all aware of this, but just walking through for those new to energy efficiency and new to energy waste reduction. Think of the portfolio. In the case of Michigan, the plan, the energy waste reduction plan is the entirety of a utility's energy efficiency efforts, what they plan to do over that plan cycle in terms of customer offerings for programs. But the portfolio is that entire collection. The program is that specific kind of bundle of measures and delivery methods to serve particular customers' needs. So you may have a low-income program offering or a commercial or industrial program offering that has an assessment as a component. It has maybe rebate aspects and maybe some direct install measures, but it's that collection of a targeted effort made up of a bunch of different measures. And so getting to measures, we have that single energy efficiency intervention, the building block. And those are, light bulbs and, different HVAC equipment and these different measures that make up the programs, and then that makes up the entire portfolio. And so the portfolio covers all programs which relate to the different sectors. Typically, we see this represented in the Midwest as residential and non-residential, although more recently, commercial and industrial have been broken out specifically. And then those kind of go down to the customer classes, the single family and multifamily, and then commercial and industrial. So multifamily in some places in the Midwest is really a hybrid kind of coding used between residential and commercial to get at the common areas as well as the residential units associated with multifamily buildings. But increasingly, I think we're seeing a real targeted effort at the whole building, the multifamily building, and that's given its own coding. And so in addition to that, we have single family low income multifamily residential units and common areas, as I mentioned, and then commercial buildings and equipment and industrial buildings and processes. So working on all of that demand side, customer side. Now, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab has put together this typology of programs that's I think really useful in thinking about the different types. This is not exhaustive, but it's a good representation of the different kinds of offerings that utilities have. And so I won't walk through all of this, but for those of you newer to energy efficiency programming, I think it's a good list and gives you a sense of all the various ways in which programs make their way to different types. Okay, and then this is our kind of basic list, and that is just breaking it out: residential and the commercial and industrial programs, and the different categories of programming that we often see from new construction and residential lighting and home energy audits. Appliance recycling is very big in Michigan, weatherization, but also multifamily housing and affordable multifamily programming, behavioral programs, those home energy reports that let you know how much better or worse you're doing than your neighbors. And then on the commercial side, and you can kind of walk through this list and see what those different opportunities are. One that's not on here is a strategic energy management, more of a process, low cost, no cost approach to improving the efficiency of building and industrial process work. And so the process of designing an energy efficiency program is probably more detailed than we can really cover today, but there are a few key aspects shown in the green boxes that we will cover a little more depth in this section. So first step in designing a program is to determine your goals. Those may be prescribed, or in some of our states that have voluntary programs, energy efficiency is really seen as a customer engagement strategy. And so you develop your own internal goals as a utility, and what do we want to achieve in terms of energy savings and bill savings for customers. And then you consider the potential savings that could be achieved to develop a bundle of measures that could be used to fit the program goals and provide those savings. Evaluating the market barriers and how to overcome them leads to the development of program elements like incentive levels, like rebate incentive levels, administrative and delivery structures, marketing, and so forth. And the estimated benefits of the program are compared to estimated costs to determine whether the planned program will be worth acquiring or will need further refinement. Right, and so in speaking about potential and thinking about what is possible for a utility to think about in providing those services and obtaining those energy savings, the amount of energy efficiency that can be saved in a state, service territory, or other jurisdiction is determined through a potential study. A potential study combines the engineering analysis with economic and market analysis to identify 3 levels of energy savings, typically. And as you can see here, technical energy efficiency potential is that total energy that could be saved by any efficiency measures without consideration of cost or willingness of users, customers, to adopt the measures. The economic potential is the subset of technical potential that is considered cost-effective compared to a supply-side energy resource alternative or other type of energy generation. And then the achievable potential is a subset of that economic potential, which is this energy savings that could be realistically achieved given real-world constraints, including market and programmatic barriers. And the achievable potential is the level of potential that utilities commonly consider when designing their suite of energy efficiency programs to make up their portfolio. It's often further narrowed to program potential or realistically achievable based on other delivery and implementation constraints. So another consideration in thinking about making up your program portfolio are those deemed savings values. So how much energy is each measure expected to save? In a little while, Greg will be speaking about evaluation, measurement, and verification methods of determining how much energy was saved as a result of a particular kind of program. But the deemed savings are those numerical or algorithmic estimates of savings per measure based on engineering specs, research, testing, and past program evaluations. And so how do you identify possible measures and deemed savings values? How do you develop these? And there's two ways we see in the Midwest. Either some utilities actually have a utility-specific measure list that they file as an appendix to their energy efficiency plans. And that contains all of the deemed savings values for all measures included in the plan. And the claim values may vary between the utilities, even in a given state. The better way, and the way that Michigan approaches it, the way that Minnesota and Illinois and others that have a technical resource manual, is to have that statewide agreed upon listing or reference guide, resource manual, whatever it's called. In Michigan, as you know, it's called MEMD, or the Michigan Energy Measures Database. That's created through the stakeholder process, approved and adopted by the Commission, common handbook for all utilities containing deemed savings values or calculations, along with source and update notes. Maintains that consistency across all utilities, and needs to be updated or it can become stale. And so here's a look at the different states in the region, and you can see that the dark blue, they have a statewide TRM. Light blue, it's optional. And there's an outdated TRM in a couple states. And then in the gray states, where really, if we're being honest, not a lot of energy efficiency programming is really being conducted. Some of those states kind of adopt or use as reference other states' TRMs, or And so that's over half of the states in the Midwest that have a statewide TRM. Yeah, and then I mentioned MEMD. You know, sure you all may be aware of this, but if you're not, maybe this is useful. You know, it's funded by Michigan's electric and natural gas utilities. It's housed in your office. Spreadsheet-based tool contains deemed savings values, customized for Michigan weather and other assumptions, and it's updated annually. And then you can see here the actual contents associated with it. Great, and then this, which I'll just linger on for a moment. This is something that we refer to at MEEA as the three-legged stool in terms of how to get sustainable policy, sustainable energy efficiency practices by utilities. And it's that utility business case. So again, I imagine many, if not all of you, are aware of the traditional utility business model is, you know, sell as much energy as you can. The more energy you sell, the more profit you make. And so this is called the throughput incentive of selling as much as you can. So energy efficiency traditionally has posed there's a disincentive to do energy efficiency because it reduces sales of energy, and therefore the utilities, particularly those investor-owned utilities with shareholders, are less inclined to engage in energy efficiency. But over time, through statewide policies or even voluntary internal policies by utilities, as I mentioned, as a customer engagement strategy or as a resiliency and reliability and long-range planning component for cost-effective, energy delivery over time, there's been this case to be made and different policies and implementation strategies to design ways to reduce that disincentive and to create that business case for utilities to run energy efficiency programs. And before I walk through these different pieces of the pie, in other states that are, Michigan has one regional transmission organization, MISO. Others have another PJM. Some of those also present a different case for energy efficiency as a capacity resource. There's an opportunity to bid the resource that you can commit to generating through running programs. And so that's another way for utilities to think about, profiting from the generation of energy savings and making that business case. But the basic business case relates to recovering the costs of running programs, so cost recovery, recovering lost revenues, so making up for those lost sales of energy efficiency. And that's really allowing the utility to maintain the authorized rate of return that they would have made on alternative supply side investments, making them neutral on energy efficiency through lost revenue adjustment mechanism. The non-big IOUs in Michigan can do decoupling. It's that way of making that to decouple, so through rate structures that decouple earnings from sales. Let's keep it simple there. And then financial incentives, that third leg, providing the utility an opportunity to earn on its energy efficiency investment by creating incentive payments for achieving specified savings targets or other goals. Michigan is the only one with a very, very clear, may not be that clear to some, but on our experience, very clear, delineated, kind of transparent. If you save this much energy, you get this return. And Illinois has something similar, but it's needlessly more complicated. And Minnesota has something somewhat similar as well. But the rest of the utilities typically do a case-by-case analysis of what did the utility accomplish and what makes sense in terms of a return to the utility for their efforts. And the last thing I'll note as we actually transition into the benefit cost analysis portion of our presentation this may seem like a lot to some, and thinking about how much are ratepayers paying into these programs, they've got to do the cost recovery, lost revenue recovery, financial incentives, but that's part of that overall cost effectiveness analysis and determining that, yeah, the customers, the ratepayers may be paying into this, but they're actually getting a net benefit on top. So with that, I will turn it over to our senior analyst, Greg Ehrenreich.
Hi. So before, as we're moving from this short-term planning that we talked about in the last session, kind of how do we build up this energy efficiency, and we'll transition then into the long-term planning after that. We're going to divert to the cost benefit analysis. It figures into all the layers of energy efficiency. It's part of program planning. It's part of IRPs. It's part of evaluation. So it's really a good bridge to move us into those advanced areas, since it's so vital to the process. So benefit cost analysis or cost effectiveness testing, we kind of use those terms interchangeably depending on who's talking. I'll probably end up using both of them as I go through this. It's not really meant to mean anything different between those two. Broadly, you could consider that benefit cost analysis is kind of the umbrella term that includes both the testing and the quantifying of the benefits and costs that go into that calculation. But I wouldn't say it's a really deep distinction that anyone ever really gets into. So either one of those terms is pretty much going to mean the same thing. A simple overview of what cost effectiveness testing is: you take your total benefits and your total costs as determined by the definition of the test that you're using. And then if your ratio is greater than 1, then it's cost effective according to that test. We do cost benefit analysis. Next slide, please. Like I said, as part of program planning and design, to determine which of those resources are worth acquiring, putting into the plans, to compare different planning options. If you've got, for example, if you had a limited budget and had to choose between two programs that you were considering offering, and you could look at the cost benefit analysis of that and determine which one was going to give you more bang for your buck. And ultimately, the goal is to be spending ratepayer funds prudently on on things that are benefiting them, by the determination of that test, obviously. And it's used in reporting and evaluation. Then, after the programs have been run and looking back at them, it's used to gauge performance relative to the planning assumptions. It's used to if you had a program that you had estimated was going to have a cost effectiveness test score of 2, and you ended up scoring 0.9, then you'd know that there was something wrong in your program assumptions. There was something that was wrong in your delivery, and it kind of helps to identify those places where you can go back and do some modifications to either enhance program performance, to eliminate an underperforming program and replace it with something else, or those sorts of aspects. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about best benefit cost analysis kind of through the lens of this document, which is called the National Standard Practice Manual. It's right now, it's the state of the industry on cost effectiveness testing. It was introduced in 2017 as the National Standard Practice Manual for Energy Efficiency. And coming up this summer, hopefully July, is going to be coming out the second edition of the NSPM, which is the National Standard Practice Manual for DERs, which covers not just energy efficiency, but the whole spectrum of distributed energy resources, including both, customer-sited generation, energy efficiency, demand response, and helps to sort of, with the goal of being able to create a common cost effectiveness framework to be able to compare all of those resources. So what the NSPM does, it's policy neutral principles for developing and refining cost effectiveness tests. It goes through a long process of evaluating what the goals of the state are, what the policy implications in the state are, and how that will move to sort of defining what should be included in the state's cost effectiveness testing. It's got that framework for sort of selecting and developing a cost effectiveness test, and input on guidance. Like, even if you have a defined cost effectiveness test like Michigan does, there's still reasons to go through this NSPM framework and identify, if you're really measuring everything that the definition of your test says you could be or should be. And really, we want to figure out which resources are worth acquiring and are going to provide a benefit to the customers. And this framework really is what we use to look at that. Next slide. The common cost effectiveness tests that are the model for all this come out of California, the California Standard Practice Manual, which was last updated in 2001. The common tests that are used are called the total resource cost test, the societal cost test, and the program administrator cost test or utility cost test. And what this diagram shows is that all three of those tests have a commonality of the core utility system impacts. Those are the impacts that directly affect the operation and cost effectiveness within the utility system itself. Then, depending on which test you're doing, then there's participant and non-utility system impacts that are also included, and that's going to depend on the definition of the test. You can see kind of this wheel around the outside. The other things that could be included are other fuel impacts, water impacts, participant impacts, low-income participant impacts, low-income societal impacts, environmental impacts, public health impacts, jobs and economic development, and energy security impacts. Those are sort of, if you look at the broad spectrum of everything that could possibly be included in cost effectiveness testing as we understand it, that's what they are. Next slide, please. So the way that those values are included, kind of there's four main ways of including values in a cost effectiveness test. The ideal is monetized, when you can you get a direct dollar value for what that cost or benefit from that measure is going to be. That's your gold standard. Then there's other methods when you can't get a monetized value, when there just isn't that research and those calculations there to be able to directly monetize something. You can use a proxy where something else stands in for what you're trying to measure, or is correlated with it, that you could use to create an estimate based on some kind of a correlation. There's the adders. That's a pretty common one of saying, okay, for this value we'll use an adder or a multiplier to represent what the value of that is in the cost effectiveness testing system. And then there's the alternative thresholds, which is where certain programs or activities aren't required to pass the same stringency of cost effectiveness testing, and that's most commonly seen when you're looking at low income programs that are done to create a societal benefit without necessarily having to meet that cost effectiveness score. Next slide. So those tests, like I mentioned, the California Standard Practice Manual is where these tests come from. And it's really what it discusses is sort of trying that these tests are intended to give us a perspective. Whose lens are we looking through at the cost effectiveness? So for the utility cost test or program administrator cost test, you're looking at what is the value of this resource to the utility system, to all the customers in the system, and to the to the operation of the utility and how that benefit is coming. The total resource cost test includes the utility system plus the actual value of the benefits to the people who participate in the energy efficiency programs. So it measures both the utility and participation. The societal cost test measures then what is the broad benefit to all of society through energy efficiency, all the customers in the state, all the customers in the service territory, everyone included. It's the most sort of broadly inclusive test is the societal. Those are the three tests, the UCT, TRC, and SCT are the ones that are most commonly used as the primary screen for cost effectiveness testing. Next slide. There's also the participant cost test and the rate impact measure are additional tests that are included in the California manual. The participant cost test measures whether the program is beneficial to the participant. It basically not looking at the utility system, just looking at the benefit to participant. It's not used as a primary cost effectiveness test anywhere except for Mississippi, which just requires multiple cost effectiveness tests. As the primary test has to pass all of them, and PCT is one of them. Then there's the rate impact measure. The rate impact measure really the question is trying to ask is, are rates going to change for people that don't participate in the energy efficiency programs? It's really an equity measure measuring the difference between participants and non-participants. And the general consensus of the entire energy efficiency industry is that it does not do a very good job of that. It doesn't tell you the magnitude of the change. It doesn't really tell you, whether considering if that rate is going to go up, whether bills are going to go up or down, and it's just basically been widely rejected. When the rate impact measure does come up, it's being brought to the fore, usually through legislation, through legislator action, where they're trying to protect ratepayers from bill increases, but generally we think in our industry that's somewhat misguided. Next slide, please. So like I said, trying to look at the utility system impacts, that then we're going to look at the program administrator cost test as a model test, or we're going to look at the core system utility impacts in that sort of that wheel model that I showed before. The effect on program participants, you can tell from the PCT and including both the utility and participant impacts. The effect on non-participants is really both best measured by kind of looking at a combination of the TRC and the SCT to see the impact on all the customer base. So you can see with that, you're going to include both the utility benefits and the broad non-utility system impacts that are included. And then if you want to, trying to look at the benefits per customer class. So what are the benefits for residential customers? What are the benefits for commercial customers? You can do the same kind of analysis that you would do at the portfolio level, at the program level. You can do it at the customer class level as well. So really, we are a little bit ahead of schedule. My next slide here is having us scheduled for our quick break on the hour. Do we want to go ahead and do that now, or do we want to move ahead and
let us know, Karen and others at PSC, if you want to do it now, we can, but we can also just finish up we thought this would get us right about to the hour, and we're a little bit early, so we can finish the benefit cost analysis slides and then move on. What do you think?
Yeah, if we could take a 5-minute break right now, that would be great. But I just want to mention to you while you're talking about both, you had mentioned the incentives and the cost benefit pieces. There's quite a few people on this phone call right now that so you mentioned that Michigan was really on top of the incentive thing and how we had it all laid out, and it made it very simple for us, which it does for energy efficiency. We have a separate legislation that's just for energy efficiency. It tells us exactly how to do everything, makes it super easy. But then in 2016 we had the IRP legislation that came out that said that shared savings mechanisms could be offered for other things, but it was so vague that we are terribly grappling with how to address that now. And so we have CVR, we have DR, we have all these other different special things that we want to see the utilities do, and they're just like throwing, incentive requests at us like crazy. And we're like, well, how do we even decide if they deserve an incentive, and what are they going to do to deserve it, and what is a good incentive? Is it, are we going to have to assess cost benefit? Because on the energy efficiency side, it tells us you have to do this UCT scoring, and that's how you decide, and everything's great and simple. And so this will hopefully help us learn a little bit more about how we can assess some of those other programs in the future that we're now grappling with.
Yeah, and I'll also add, I saw the order and request for comments come out from your office yesterday. I think it's a great question. One note coming out of the passage of PA 341 and PA 342 was there seems to be a similar incentive structure for both EWR planning purposes and performance there, as well as integrated resource planning success and performance. And squaring those is a question. Let me. There was a provision in PA 341 that I thought existed that, let's take this 5-minute break because I just want to look and see. My understanding was that there was an enabling kind of provision that allowed the PSC to consider kind of the totality of things that the utilities would potentially recover and right size that and customize that rather than just pile on. Right. And so trying to prevent a shortfall, and also prevent a windfall.
Right.
So you're probably all aware and are probably thinking and want to yell out the vision. I can't remember exactly what it is, but that seems like something that hasn't been triggered.
We just can't we can't interpret it. It created more questions for us than answers. So
yeah. Gotcha. So let's take that 5-minute break, and I'll mention what that is. Probably won't get into too much more on what we think is the best way forward, or how we think the incentive structure should be interpreted. But these are exactly the questions I think. Yeah, the PA 341, 342 try to solve a lot of issues, and at the same time, different language is used in each of the statutes, and net benefit versus net present value and those kinds of things. So
yep.
Yeah, totally understand. But yeah, let's take that break, and then we'll come back to cost benefit.
Okay, we'll come back at 5 minutes. That would be 1:52.
Okay.
Great.
Hi, everybody. I hope we're all back from that break and ready to get started here. Whenever you're ready, Nick, and you can advance the slide.
There you go.
Great. Hold on. I have an emergency situation. My kid just locked themselves out. Hold on, half a second.
I'll take over briefly. No worries, Craig. Great. So this just gives you a sense. We wanted to give that regional perspective on the different tests that are used across the region. It's kind of a mixed bag. There are some states that allow for a lot of different tests, but then they have a specific primary test. As you'll see, it's pretty well dominated by the TRC, the total resource test. We put PAC here, the program administrator cost test. I recognize that the UCT, and actually it's more complicated than that, the test that Michigan has codified, we'll get into that in a little bit.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem. I tried to cover.
So here we are, cost effectiveness tests in the Midwest. The primary test is basically pass this test in order to be considered cost effective. Secondary tests are used for additional levels of screening to help decide between tests to show the benefit for everyone in different ways. But each state generally has one primary test that they use for cost effectiveness testing. For most of the Midwest, that's the total resource cost test. There's a couple states that use the program administrator cost test, that including Michigan, although that's not Michigan's name for it. And we'll get into that in a minute. And then there's 2 states that use the societal cost test as their primary screen. In general, the way that those tests come about, the way that they're picked as the primary screen, can kind of come through 3 different methods. They're either stated in legislation, the primary test shall be the total resource cost test, or it's sort of stated generally in legislation. In order to judge the cost effectiveness test, you'll consider it from the perspective of the utility and participants. Or it can be very broad. The regulatory commission will determine a method for assessing the cost effectiveness. So there's sort of that, it sort of depends on how in the weeds the legislators get in how they're defining it. So like I said, Michigan's test is basically, it's the program administrator cost test or the utility cost test. In Michigan, it's defined in legislation as the utility system resource cost test, but it's functionally equivalent to the PAC. And we'll cover a little bit more on Michigan's test specifically in the next few slides. Next slide, please. The reason it's important to sort of look at this broadly is that really, even though we say that there's 8 of the 13 states in the Midwest are using the TRC test, not all TRC tests are created equal. There's kind of, you see the small picture shows that model test that I showed before of the TRC. And then some examples showing, what's actually included in the TRC tests in Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin as comparisons. So you can see, even though, generally you would expect that the TRC would include or could include in the model other fuel impacts, water impacts, participant impacts, and low-income customer participant impacts. In practice, the TRC in Illinois includes all those impacts most of the time, though it doesn't include all of the, in some cases doesn't include the participant benefits and costs symmetrically. It also includes an environmental impact. Part of the legislation in Illinois that started energy efficiency required and that the future cost of carbon be estimated and included in cost effectiveness testing. So that's an example of something that's sort of outside of the model TRC that's included in Illinois. In Indiana, there's some of the impacts are included that would be in the model TRC, but not all of them. It's really mostly those utility core system impacts and looking at some of the participant and non-participant impacts, but doesn't include those other fuel or water impacts. And in Wisconsin, where they also call it their test, the total resource cost test, they really don't include any of those participant costs and benefits or other fuel impacts or water or anything. And actually, when they reviewed and really looked at their test, they're not including all of the utility system impacts either in Wisconsin. So, that's sort of the why when I sort of in my introduction to this section, I talked about the costs and benefits, as defined in the test that you're using. It's because even if you call your test a TRC, it really comes down to what in practice is included in your state definitions, what's included in the ways that the utilities are calculating it, and just because it says it's the TRC, that doesn't really mean that it's going to match up with a TRC in any other state. Next slide.
Can I ask a question?
Sure. Yeah.
This is Sarah Molkoff. You mentioned that is it always determined through legislation which cost test a state uses?
It is typically included through legislation, but in some cases that legislation is just broadly giving the commission the authority to determine what test to use. What's my example on that? Minnesota, their legislation is shall consider the impacts to society participants and everything, but it does not define specifically what test. And then the commission went back and it was their determination that because of what the legislation said, that their determination was that they would be doing the societal cost test in the state, but it was not specifically defined.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. So Michigan's cost effectiveness test, then it's defined in statute. The utility system resource cost test means a standard that's met when the total avoided supply side cost of the provider are greater than the total cost to the provider of administering and delivering the program. So what that really is hitting at is those core utility system impacts, the cost to the provider and the benefits to the provider, but from basically monetized through avoided supply side costs. So that looking then at the model there of the program administrator cost test, the test is basically right in alignment with that model of the program administrator cost test, where those core utility system impacts are included, but it doesn't include any quantification measurement of the participant and non-utility system impacts. I guarantee you the utilities are running those tests. They're reporting those other tests besides the test. That's part of their calculations, whether or not they're required. The software that they use runs all the tests. And that helps them to do those things like determining whether one program is better for another for their purposes, those sort of, internal decision making, things like that. But so the primary test really looks in Michigan like the utility cost test. Next slide. So digging in deeper then of what those core utility system impacts are that could be included. There's both costs and benefits. And one of the core principles of the NSPM framework is that if you're considering costs, you need to also consider benefits. You should never include costs without including benefits. You shouldn't include benefits without including costs in the same area. It's this a principle of symmetry between cost and benefit measures. So looking at cost effectiveness impacts in that utility system impacts, it's really the utility cost of the measure, the amount that utility is going to pay for that installation, the program administration costs, and the other financial and technical support costs that go along with running the programs in the portfolio, the costs of doing the EM&V, which is the measurement and verification process that goes on after the test, and then obviously any costs for shareholder incentives are also part of that utility system cost. That's considered the on the benefits to the utility, where I've got colored in the dark orange here. Those are sorry, the dark orange is the cost, the white is the benefits. I'm mixing myself up here. So looking at the benefits then on the left hand side are sort of the major ones that you see most often: the avoided marginal energy costs, avoided generation capacity costs. Those are most common. Avoided transmission delivery costs, avoided transmission and delivery line losses are also pretty common. On the right hand side, the list of benefits there are the ones that you see less commonly included, though they could be. They fit under the definition of the test, and that these are benefits to the utility system. Some of wholesale price suppression, if you allow for that. Avoided credit and collection costs is an important part for the utility and for the customers. The avoided cost of renewable standard compliance. If you reduce your overall load on the system, then you have to bring less renewables online to comply with renewable standards. Other avoided environmental compliance costs, SOx and NOx, and ozone avoidance costs that you don't need to do if you're not generating that electricity. Increased system reliability, reduced financial risks for the utility, and market transformation. Those are all benefits that can be included in sort of that broad model of the utility cost test. So if you were doing what it considers to be a perfect utility cost test, it would include some way of measuring all of these. Next slide. So in Michigan, basically it includes what system impacts are included in Michigan. This comes from a resource called the Database of State Efficiency Screening Practices, DSESP, which is hosted by the same group E4 that publishes the NSPM, and it's a database. They went around and dug in on every state and province. So there's all 50 states, District of Columbia and Puerto Rico are included, and it looks at what each state is really including out of the impacts that go into their cost effectiveness testing, both on the core utility system impacts that I'm showing here, and also in participant and non-participant impacts, which I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on today because Michigan doesn't include those, but I do encourage you to look at the NSPM and look at the DSESP if you're interested in understanding how Michigan compares to all of the other states. So Michigan includes all of the basic core utility system impact costs. Those are all included in Michigan's testing, and those sort of fundamental avoided costs that everyone pretty much measures: the avoided energy and capacity costs and avoided T&D costs. Interestingly, Michigan does also have an adder for market transformation that's included, which is a pretty novel in the Midwest. Next slide. So if we look at sort of where Michigan is in comparison to the rest of the Midwest, this shows which of those utility system costs are included by the 13 states that MEEA covers. And Michigan is right up there with most of the states, including all of those major losses, or major impacts. The shareholder incentive costs, only 3 states include that because only those 3 states have the shareholder incentives that are allowed under the law. So if you don't have shareholder incentives, you're not going to include that cost, obviously. So most of the states in the Midwest include about 1/3 of the impacts. And then there's several impacts which are included by about half of the additional states. There's some variability. There's some uncertainties about whether that was whether costs were included or not, or in some cases like one utility will include it but another won't. So some variability there, but in general, Michigan's testing is very much online with what's being measured and included in tests in the rest of the Midwest. Next slide. Bring up, like, Michigan, obviously, like I said, doesn't include non-utility system impacts, except that there is the one non-utility system impact that is considered in Michigan, which is low income, and that's included through an alternative threshold of not requiring low income programs to pass that USRCT score of greater than 1. Obviously, if you're a utility and you're running a low income program, you would like to get that as close to 1 as possible, because that means you're still, you're spending as prudently as you can on this program and providing as much system benefit as you can out of it. So you'd rather be running a program that was scoring a 0.9 than a 0.1 in this case. Even though you're not required to pass, it's still a benefit to everything to try to get that score up. Include those benefits where you can. And the reason that low income programs aren't going to score well on these tests is typically because that the utility pays the full portion of the measure cost, and that's gonna affect the balance on those equations. So that's kind of covers the broad cost effectiveness testing. If there was any questions anyone had about the cost effectiveness testing section before we move on, I'd be happy to answer those. Great, then let's go on. So now we're going to talk about long-term planning.
Yeah, and I'll give you a little. Oh wait, yeah. Is there a question? Oh, okay. So this is Nick again. I'll take over for here, and Greg and I are going to tag team this section. I'll do about the first half, and he'll jump back in, but I'll give him a break. So here we're going to talk through integrated resource planning in the Midwest generally, goals and components, incorporating energy efficiency, how that's done. There are a few different ways of doing that in IRPs. Cost effectiveness screening for purposes of this integrated resource planning process, the value of stakeholder input, and then talking through the value of EE in terms of risk and uncertainty. All right, great. So we like this definition from Regulatory Assistance Project, or RAP. Every state has their own definition or reason for those who run integrated resource plans, but we like this one. It's a utility plan for meeting forecasted annual peak and energy demand, plus some established reserve margin through a combination of supply side and demand side resources over a specified future period. I think Michigan's one of the only states that has a multiple forecast associated with it. Most states just say 10-year forecast, 15-year forecast. Michigan requires the 5, 10, and 20, or 10, 15, 20, something like that. So that's a little different and really interesting. So the integrated resource planning in the Midwest. Dark blue, these are the states. 7 states have formal integrated resource planning processes for electric utilities, and 4 more have another state electricity planning requirement that's a similar role to an IRP. And so the utilities either submit a kind of status report as their IRP, or they do a full kind of integrated resource assessment and modeling, which is more akin to the Michigan and Minnesota and Indiana. It's and energy efficiency actually factors in as a major consideration or requirement in those 3 states' utility integrated resource plans. But some of the other states have either they're deregulated completely, and so the regional transmission organization it works with, say, in Illinois, the Illinois Power Agency to establish wide procurement plans for energy and capacity for the state's investor-owned utilities. Ohio is something similar. Ohio utilities file an annual long-term forecast report detailing their future energy capacity needs, but that's kind of it. It's not as integrated and robust, I would say, as what Michigan and Minnesota and Indiana even have. So we have additional details on other states, but I'm going to keep moving us here. This is a slide that we'd like to put together. There was a lot of talk, I don't know, 5+ years ago when integrated resource planning was coming back into vogue after a lot of time off since the 80s and early 90s. Integrated resource plan is back, and the value is really seen as a way to think through holistically the energy system and forecasting supply under a series of scenarios of demand and other prices and other factors going forward. So we like this because we like to think about this in terms of maybe you have an energy efficiency resource standard that requires you to save a certain amount of energy or requires you to spend a certain amount towards saving energy. Or maybe you have a voluntary energy efficiency, but you also have an integrated resource plan. And how well are these communicating, these different policy efforts, and what is there a dividing line of value here? And I think you can see that those states that have both, Michigan and Minnesota, are the clear, not that there's a competition between states, I would say, in terms of how much energy you're saving, but translate to how cost effectively those in-state utilities are then forecasting out and planning long-term energy supply. I think Minnesota and Michigan in particular are showing that a robust integrated resource plan may help you factor in that cost-effective resource of energy efficiency, may help you factor that in better in a more integrated way. One note on Ohio, last year they actually repealed their energy efficiency resource standard, and they're going to, it's actually, the jury's still out. The commission is still determining whether or not they're going to allow and to what extent they're going to allow voluntary electric programming. And Iowa has taken a couple rollbacks of late. This is 2018 information. Illinois put in the Future Energy Jobs Act in 2016, and I anticipate that in 2019, 2020, 2021, they will probably be closer to the level that Minnesota and Michigan are achieving. But here, it gives it to you as a percentage of total retail electricity sales. So kind of an interesting look at great. And then why, hey, Greg, do you want to mute yourself? Just sorry. So why plan for both supply and demand side together? Plan for reliable, cost-effective, long-term electricity system to create a system that is nimble and can adapt to changes in grid, weather, economy, lower costs for the utility customer. EE as a supply side and demand side resource, can really help target inefficient building stock to better plan for the future at a lower cost. So in thinking about the components of how are we modeling and carrying out an integrated resource planning process, IRP modeling should consider a few portfolios relative to the base case, at least 2 load forecasts and a range of energy efficiency scenarios with various levels of customer incentives to cover incremental costs of energy measures. Planners should be able to compare levelized cost curves for demand side resources to those developed for supply side resources. And so, have a lot on that. I mean, demand side resource assumptions uses inputs to IRP should be based on those potential studies conducted by an independent third party. I mean, this is consistent. Everything I'm saying is consistent with the way in which Michigan operates. I think we use Michigan and Minnesota and Indiana and talking to other states with significantly less robust and less defined integrated resource planning processes to really share these kinds of best practices. So I don't think I'm saying anything out of step in what Michigan does and how you all should be interpreting, your statutory provisions. Rather, we use some of these talking points to really let people know about the good things happening in Michigan. And so supply side options and fuel prices, those kind of cost benefit tests, IRPs should specify that supply sources and demand side resources be treated equally. Plans should specify the types of resource cost tests that should be used to evaluate those inputs, those resource inputs. And in some cases, as allowable by statute, non-energy benefits, including socioeconomic benefits, health, safety, and environmental benefits, should be considered or considered where, like I said, where allowable in a particular state statute. And considering other objectives like minimizing the utility's present value revenue requirements, such as environmental impacts, fuel diversity, reliability, rate, bill. There's a laundry list in PA 341, Section 6T, as you all are aware, that lays out exactly what's required. Michigan utilities, this is generally should be required. System needs, fuel prices, etc. So I'll move to the next slide. And so this is levelized cost for the utilities. So those energy efficiency costs of saved energy values are based on the program administrator cost only. Energy efficiency, as you can see, is much cheaper on a levelized cost per kWh basis than supply side resources. So of course there are overlaps in the ranges, and not every kWh can be supplied for the same cost. And of course, energy efficiency can only supplant at most a few % of annual consumption. But on the basis of cost, it should be one of the top resources considered for acquisition, and particularly in the Midwest, it's at the lower level of cost comparison compared to even the national energy efficiency range. And I recognize only rooftop solar is included. This analysis, or we just didn't include any the utility scale development of solar in here for comparison. And Greg just developed this new slide. I'm going to let him talk about that, and then I'll pick back up with the next slide. Greg, if you don't. Greg, you're on mute because I
I didn't really develop this slide. I just, I lifted this graph from Chuck Goldman's group at Berkeley Labs, and this is to show that when we're talking about that cost of energy efficiency and that cost range, not every energy efficiency program, not every efficiency measure is going to cost the same. Just like you can do with the supply side, you can make demand side cost curves. So here you can see, on this, there's the really low cost building codes and standards there at the left side. Residential consumer product rebates are another one that's a low cost for a lot of savings. And as you move up the curve and look at different measures, it then goes all the way up into the more expensive measures that have a higher cost and account for a smaller part of the savings in the portfolio. Things like new construction measures, multifamily retrofits, kind of any whole building retrofit program, and low income programs. Those all have kind of a much higher administrative cost for the utility to run, which is part of the reason that when you look at what utilities have traditionally been doing for energy efficiency, you see a lot down at that low end of the cost curve, those prescriptive measures, those product rebates, the low hanging fruit. And as some of the standards and things have picked up and dug in on the lighting standards that are cutting into some of those product rebate savings, utilities are having to dig a little deeper and head up that cost curve to some of those more expensive measures in order to still meet their savings goals.
Great, thanks, Greg.
Yeah.
Okay, so You'll have me for another couple slides here, and then we'll jump back to Greg. So how do we incorporate energy efficiency into integrated resource plans? I think it's done differently in a couple states in our region for sure. There's the baked in approach, kind of the must build, you may think of it, in which states where there's an energy efficiency resource standard exists, the resources necessary to satisfy that minimum level of requirement are modeled as must build resources. So in Minnesota, it's 1.5% of annual retail sales must be saved. So there you go. You have to, at a minimum, you have to do that. Or in Michigan, 1% on the electric side, 0.75 on the gas side. The next category is allowed to compete. Model energy efficiency is a virtual power plant bundle or bundles, sometimes mixed with demand response resources that go against other generation supply side resources in optimization models. So Michigan does some of this. This is all Indiana really does, because they don't have a minimum kind of savings requirement on an annual basis. The utilities have individual goals that they work out with their commission. So instead, they look at ways that they can create these bundles to compete against fixed or actual developed generation resources. And then the hybrid is doing that both, similar to Michigan and Minnesota. Factor in as a minimum what's required, but then these are cost-effective resources, as you saw on the previous couple slides back, and let the bundles kind of compete with other resources that you're considering on the supply side. And this is how you would maybe theoretically think through that virtual power plant kind of bundling. So you'd have the generation characteristics associated with a combined cycle power plant, and then the DSM bundle characteristics associated with EE and maybe some demand response or other considerations and factors there. So you can see if you put them up side by side here, you can start to get a comparative analysis that the modeling software can work with for integrated resource planning. And now I'm going to kick it back over to Greg, and he's going to walk us through this next series. And just as a time check, we've got about 35 minutes left. So just want to provide that time check. We've got another section after this. So
great. Integrated resource planning, trying to look at then how do we kind of go through a little deeper dig on that process of how they're building those bundles, how utilities and their consultants are creating those things those bundles that can compete in their resource screening. Generally, you're going to start with your potential studies, just like you do with most any energy efficiency. Get that understanding of sort of what your maximum that could go in, what makes sense, including sometimes specific market sector potential studies, an industrial sector study, a low income study, a multifamily study that dig deeper into those specific market segments where you need some more deeper information. Then there's you need to think through the benefit cost screening, how you determine which of those resources that could be included are going to be worth including, and then we're gonna spend some time on that one in the next few slides. And then sort of how you take those resources that you've determined are worth including, and how you then create modelable resources with those. It's often there's a fine line between making sure it's cost effective and over screening, and that's what I'm going to address in the next slide. So in sort of the selection model process, there's sort of there's a couple of pitfalls we've seen coming from especially like back when in sort of 2014, 2016 IRPs, we were seeing this a lot, and it was something that got commented on by various stakeholders and has improved a lot in the 2018, 2019 IRPs that we've seen around the region. But I sort of want to give you this picture of where it can go wrong. There's a potential to just kind of over screen. So you take your broad universe of measures from your cost effectiveness test. You've got that technical level of resources, everything that could possibly be saved in your state or jurisdiction. Then you do that cost effectiveness screen on the individual measures. Each individual measure go through, determine whether it's going to be cost effective, and then that reject that. You get down to your economic potential through that. Then you look at your customer adoption rates, your market, and then whittle that down to the achievable potential. So then there's often with the achievable potential from the potential studies, then when they go into modeling, they screen that down a little further to what they call the program potential or realistically achievable potential, which is meant to sort of model market on the conditions on the ground in the marketplace, the ability of the utility to deliver those programs, internal staffing capacity, and workforce, things like that, to sort of reject more possible energy efficiency. And then they take everything that's left from that and use different methods to sort of build those into bundles. Those bundles are typically, they'll do it based on the load shape, the 8760 load shape of different resources. So everything with these load shapes that are residential, we'll put those together. These commercial lighting load shapes, residential HVAC, sort of different groups based on those load shapes and how they fit together into the bundles. And then the problematic thing that we've seen is then taking those bundles that have been developed and then running another cost effectiveness screen on them on those individual bundles. So taking a bunch of measures that have already been determined through your economic screen in your potential study, putting them into bundles and then rescreening them. Often, a different consulting group than did the potential study is doing this resource planning, and they're using different software, different assumptions, which can go into it. And somehow, these measures that were all cost effective on their own combined into bundles, and suddenly they're determining that some of these bundles are now no longer cost effective, and they're dropping out some of these classes of bundles. Then they're running the selection model, and whatever's left is what they get. And so my point here is that there's sort of a lot of places where utilities can be dropping possible measures and possible energy efficiency out of the process. And it's important to sort of take a step back and look at that and say, like I said, like if it's cost effective here, why isn't it cost effective here when you're including the same things? So let's go to the next slide. So there's,
Greg, this is Karen, before you go on to the next slide. So this is something that, the energy efficiency team has really struggled with through the IRP process. And I know you call this a generalized example, but this is really one of our biggest struggles because, we get that achievable potential, whether through our potential study or someone else's potential study. But then when we get down to these bundles, it's like breaking down those bundles and trying to figure out what they're putting in there and how they're valuing it and why, all of a sudden at that point, energy efficiency is getting rejected at a high level, is what's, a huge struggle for us.
Yeah, it's been a huge struggle for me too as I read through, a handful of IRPs every year and try to, understand what they're doing. And I think a lot of times it's, it comes from sort of different things. Your potential study is 3 or 4 years old, and now you're using, updated thing that figures in. So, the sort of freshness of that potential study is really can be a big factor in that. You see sometimes utilities will, if they're trying to avoid doing another full expensive potential study, they'll do some market updates to try to look at what has changed in the market since that potential study was done, and update the assumptions that are going into some of their calculations. They also look at trying to look at what measures were rejected in the last IRP, what things didn't make it through into the ultimate selected plan, and looking back and trying to examine what the assumptions are for those measures to see if there's anything that's changed in those areas, measures that didn't make it through that might make it through now, or other measures, things that have come onto the market since the potential study was done that weren't previously included. So yeah, lots of moving parts, and it's definitely a lot to get your hand on. So actually on my next slide, I'm going to hit a couple of points on some of the things that we do to sort of alternatives to over screening that we've seen that I think are valuable approaches to think about. Obviously, like, don't do your cost effectiveness testing at every stage. If you're doing a cost effectiveness screen at one stage, then you don't retest your bundles if you're putting them, bundling cost effectiveness test or cost effective measures into your bundle, then there's no need to retest the bundle as a whole. Or you could use the, instead of screening down to the economic and achievable potential, use the broader, the technical potential to develop your bundles, and then do your cost effectiveness testing on the bundles and eliminate them that way. So you're only testing once, either testing before bundling or testing before or after bundling, but not testing, in both cases. You also, there's some trade-offs with modeling time that you're going to get with the number of different scenarios you're developing, but using cost tiers and other factors to create more smaller bundles, so that for example, you might reject the most expensive third of the measures, but you didn't reject all of commercial HVAC because there was enough expensive ones in there that when you bundle them all together, it makes it not worth acquiring. But there's some individual measures in there that still would be cost effective. Especially when you look at some of this bundling measures, that they take, these approaches, these bundles don't look like energy efficiency programs really. This is a bunch of lighting measures grouped together. So you have your expensive, your mid-range, and your low cost lighting measures as bundles. But when you look at an actual energy efficiency program, a residential direct install program is going to install lighting. It might install some weather stripping. It might install, faucet aerators, power strips. It's sort of, these bundles are a whole bunch of measures that look like each other, and programs are often built of measures that don't look like each other, that when they come together, they're a cost-effective program. So part of the reason that I bring that up is because then there's sort of these generic energy efficiency approaches that have been tried in a few places, where instead of looking at bundles of specific measures, they try to develop just sort of bundles of generic energy efficiency at a cost level. And we'll hit the next slide. This is an example of a generic energy efficiency approach that Vectren did in their 2016 IRP in Indiana. what they did was they built 8 bundles a year, adding up to 2% possible energy efficiency a year. So 0.25% bundles, 8 of them, that each bundle had a cost associated with it that was flat across the year, and then would escalate for each additional year. Then they ran through their selection model and allowed it to select these bundles of energy efficiency, which they had developed cost through some research. They worked with I think some consultants and an academic group, both to sort of develop what these cost curves looked like on this. And they're not using this model again. I really liked it. I thought it was interesting because of what I'd said about trying to look at savings in a more generic way of energy efficiency. The director of their commission said he thought it was an interesting effort, but because these costs that they came up with didn't rely very well on the actual costs for the utility. It was more broad kind of national costs and things. He wasn't that into this approach. They didn't use it again. They've gone back to using their market potential study to build their bundles. But I thought this was an interesting effort, and I think that it really kind of got to the point of trying to look at energy efficiency in a way that isn't specifically tied to what measures that we knew about in the market when the potential study was done, and allowing it to sort of leave that decision on what measures are going to be picked to program design. And I think that's a valuable thing that IRPs can do, but I don't think that they've completely figured out how to do it yet. So we're still kind of, I think that it will end up that way at some point. At least that's my opinion on it. Next slide. This is another on the next slide is another approach, also out of Indiana. This was from NIPSCO's 2018 IRP. It was a model that was proposed by stakeholders in the stakeholder process. And this was sort of a different generic model where they built decrements of increasing energy efficiency. Each decrement had associated savings and cost over time with it, and trying to build a model that could then pick sort of each additional slice of energy efficiency there. The critique of this one was that there's a time value of energy efficiency that this didn't really capture. Sometimes energy efficiency is more valuable if you do it now than if you do it 5 years out, or some of these values that couldn't figure into this. Some of the load shapes, another thing. So I wanted to kind of show you these generic approaches, because it's likely you'll probably see some of this as time goes on. I think DTE's last IRP was somewhat similar to this in kind of building blocks of energy efficiency that didn't have specific measures associated with them. So I think it's valuable to think about these approaches. We'll see where they go. Next slide. Stakeholder input is important in integrated resource planning. Indiana and Michigan and Minnesota, all the states that kind of have the most robust IRPs in the Midwest, all have language that talks about stakeholder input and involving customers or other interested parties. They all do it a little differently. Minnesota's is very much a like docketed, file into the docket with your public comments. Michigan has both some commenting and some stakeholder meetings. Indiana's is very much stakeholder meeting process. Indiana, the IRPs are a little different than Michigan and Minnesota. They're not a docketed proceeding at all. They're not contested. They're more of a an open process, and so there's a really heavy emphasis in Indiana on holding public meetings, which has made the IRP process a little dampened down this summer than what it was in previous years. Next slide. One of the keys that in any of integrated resource planning is looking at risk and uncertainty. How do these different portfolios and scenarios they develop match up to each other in terms of uncertainty and in terms of risk? And it's important that they look at that with energy efficiency as well. When they're looking at these stochastic analyses and things, that they should do it on energy efficiency as well, because when they have done it, when they've looked at this, energy efficiency really comes out as a low risk resource compared to a lot of other resources. Even when low market price conditions, energy efficiency still has value to save energy. There's not the outages. It's not subject as much to the fuel price fluctuations, except as how those influence the avoided costs. But it generally is low risk, and so it's important that when you're looking at risk, that's energy efficiency gets considered. Let's move on to the next slide then. So if we got any more questions about the IRPs, we can get that. Otherwise, I will go into the reporting and evaluation. All right.
Yeah, and this is Nick. I just want to note that we've got 17 minutes. If we end up kind of going right to the hour with content, please reach out to any of us, and I'd love to continue the dialogue and make sure that maybe we can get in front of you all again and talk about some other topics. We try to keep this specific to cost benefit. Great, go ahead, Gary.
Yep. Okay, so reporting and evaluation, this is to just kind of wrap up the energy efficiency process. Reporting and evaluation is what happens after you run the programs. We'll cover the types of evaluation, some definitions, some of what the variation is, and just talk a little bit about reporting and data issues. Next slide. So there's 3 types of reasons that we do evaluation, measurement, and verification. First is impact evaluation, which is really looking at how much of the energy that was saved can properly be attributed to the programs that were saving the energy. There's process evaluation, which is how do we improve the programs? How do we improve program delivery? And then there's the deemed savings review, which is when looking back and saying, we said a light bulb was going to save this much energy, and we installed a light bulb and went back out and measured it, and it actually saved this much. So going back and being able to keep those TRMs fresh and updated and make sure that those values are accurate, so that when you do your planning compared to your results, you're going to get similar results that you planned, and your expected savings and your actual savings are going to be closer to each other if you kind of do that constant review. Next slide. So then sort of, when we talk about those savings, there's going to be ex ante savings and ex post savings. That's before and after the evaluation process. So the ex ante savings are what the utility is reporting, sort of that right away first measurement. This is what we saved. Then the ex post is going to be, after we've done the evaluation, we've accounted for free ridership, we've accounted for other factors that figure in, and this is what really was saved that can be attributed to those programs. Next slide. We've already covered 2 of these definitions, but the third one to hit is the net to gross ratio. The net to gross ratio is that difference between your gross savings, the total measured energy efficiency, and the savings that are properly attributed to the utility's portfolio or to the program, and that's going to give you a net to gross ratio. And it's one of those where typically you'd want to have that be 1 in an ideal situation. What you reported is really what you saved. That's not typically the case, but that's where you'd want it to be. So free mentioning that free ridership is people who saved energy from the program without participating people that weren't in your service territory, but drove into your service territory to a store and bought a light bulb that was bought down by a program. And so that's going to be a free rider, someone who wasn't a valid participant but still participate in the savings. Spillover is the other side of the coin from free rider. Spillover is people who weren't directly part of the program, but saved energy anyway. So, like, for example, they participated in one program and then went out and did energy efficiency on their own without program participation, some of those factors. So basically, free ridership knocks your savings down. Spillover adds to your savings. Spillover is much less often considered than free ridership. Next slide. EM and V requirements can just differ between states. There's different requirements for when you do it, how often you do it, what the stringency is, and how those results are used, whether you're doing impact analysis, whether you're doing process analysis. Those just all differ between the requirements of the state. Next slide. So there's data issues that come up with all of this energy efficiency reporting, and I want to hit on those because I'm a data guy and I spend a lot of time looking at different filings across lots of states. So EIA 861 is an interesting one because that's the federal requirement for reporting. It's got an energy efficiency component in it, and that's very much it's interesting because it reports residential, commercial, and industrial sectors as well as transportation. Well, generally, state reporting is residential and non-residential. So you end up with those numbers not always matching up well between what you see in a utility filing at the commission level and what you're seeing in the utility filing on their annual 861 filing. Which can be a problem because, for us from a research standpoint, especially, we like to see that industrial number separated if we can, because there's a lot of policy things going on with industrial energy efficiency. So it's nice to have a way to measure that, and it's not really happening at the state level. So we can only get that data for the most part from the feds. There's standardization. Standardization of reporting is really a great thing when there's an annual scorecard that all utilities have to fill out, or every report has a table G with the same information in it. That sort of thing. It's easier for staff. It's easier for advocates. It's easier for researchers to compare across utilities, across years, across program cycles. So the more standardization of reporting, the better. There's sort of different needs of data, and LB&L did a nice analysis of that. Let's go to the next slide. Back in 2013, they looked at this sort of, what data would be available from utilities that would enable sort of different levels of analysis. What's the baseline? What additional data enables good intrastate and regional assessment? And then, the additional data level that they'd like to see for doing their really broad regional and national assessments of the data. So this is something I'd like to show to anybody who's thinking about reports and whatever. Like there's levels of report, and I'd say my feeling on where Michigan is on this. Michigan is kind of between the tier 2 and tier 3, so you've got really very good data reporting coming out of your utilities in Michigan compared to some of the other parts of the region, and really it enables some of these researchers to really use Michigan as one of the places that they're studying and including in these national databases. And so that's really important, and good job for Michigan. So now we're going to hit some of this is going to be kind of fast going through the emerging issues in energy efficiency. These are the things that we're seeing when we go to conferences, the things that we're trying to get the information out about, the things that are exciting to us. as an energy efficiency industry, and are kind of the indicators of where energy efficiency is going to be going. So I'm going to hit on performance-based regulation, time values, advanced metering, and demand flexibility. Next slide. Performance-based regulation is sort of getting it out of that cost of service regulation model that we do now and looking at how do we tie a rate of return to achieving policy outcomes. Michigan did a big study on that in 2018, so I encourage you to go look that up and read through it if this is what you're interested in. But really it's sort of instead of looking at that after the fact involvement with reporting, the regulatory role kind of comes in before the fact. This is what we want you to achieve, and here's how we've decided that it's going to be measured, and then looking at the outcomes at the end. Kind of it makes it a little more agnostic in terms of delivery. Removes some of the disincentives for non-capital solutions and really makes it based on meeting goals rather than just the pure saving energy. You can work other goals into it. So performance-based regulation is interesting, and Michigan is really leading the way in Midwest understanding of this right now. Next slide.
Yeah, and I'll just add, many of you on this call are probably well aware of this and worked on this report. And this is great. This is a slide that we share with other states in the region and talking through the great work that you all are on the vanguard of looking into. That's great.
Next slide, please. Time-sensitive value of energy efficiency. This is being studied a lot by Natalie Mims-Frick and Lisa Schwartz out of Berkeley Labs. They're working on this a lot. This is looking at you look at this. There's some peaks on this graph. The red and orange peak area that I've got highlighted. That's the present value of energy efficiency from different reasons. And you're looking at that peak says, right here, if you're saving energy during this time, that it's got a really high value to the system. Whereas where I've got it highlighted in green, if you're saving energy at that low demand period, you're not avoiding those high T&D and capacity costs from the peak, and so it's less valuable energy efficiency. It might still pass cost effectiveness and be valuable, but that saving it at the peak is going to be the most valuable. Next slide. So this, some of the, if you can look at some of the smart metering and things are enabling really being able to look at specific customers. Even there are customers that you can target with energy efficiency that provide more value to the systems, and there's people that are participating in programs that are actually decreasing, program value, negative savers, that even though they've participated in the energy efficiency program, their energy use is still going up. So if you can, find ways through software, through measuring, through targeting to find those people that are those, target those customers that are going to provide the most value to the system. Next slide. Load shaping and rate design, demand flexibility is another big area that's coming into it. This is they call it the shed, shift, shimmy, but these are the sort of the different ways that different rate structures can influence how much energy you use and when. So example, just a straight volumetric charge, if you reduce that, you're through energy efficiency and save all the time, versus demand charges and peak pricing that influence saving energy at a specific time of use rates that lead you to shift your energy use to different times of the day, or then real-time pricing where you can really get into second or sub-second level modulation between generation and efficiency and different load balancing. Next slide. The reason that we need that kind of demand flexibility is because our buildings are just getting a lot smarter than traditional energy efficiency programs are. So the term grid interactive efficient buildings is sort of the national term that we use for it. And this is the buildings that have, all of these optimization, smart appliances, smart thermostats, occupancy sensors, building automation systems. And with the smart meters, they can then talk directly to the grid, send out those price signals, receive price signals, turn things on and off, and really be able to interact on their own without or with very limited human intervention, but still be able to make those economic choices sort of at the building level. Next slide. So really what that enables, what all of these things that I'm talking about here enable is turning energy efficiency and distributed energy resources in general into a grid resource. So you take all of those customers that are doing, you got smart buildings, you got demand response, you got energy efficiency, and those are just all sort of individual pieces of data from individual customers. And then there's a role of an aggregator, which could be a utility, it could be like a distribution operator, it could be a third party, but the aggregator then takes all that individual data and builds it into packages that then can be sold into the energy market, sold into that through the smart grid, sold into the smart market, and they can actually be dispatchable. They have load shapes, they have resource curves, and really can be a valuable component of the broad energy market. And that's it on the quick overview of energy issues. Back to you, Nick.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Greg. So in my closing, I've got two quick slides, this and a question slide. And before I do that, one other trend that we didn't mention is electrification, building electrification and vehicle electrification. And we're looking into that. It's something that the big question right now is, do you use energy efficiency plan dollars for electrification work? That's one question. Another question, of course, is fuel switching and whether utilities are in favor of that or not. Dual fuel utilities may feel differently than all gas utilities and may feel different than all electric utilities, which we have in some of our other states. So just wanted to provide that. I think we would be happy to provide some information on where we're seeing the conversations around electrification and some of the sticking points, as well as some of the cost impacts and other issues that are coming up. That's something that we are looking into. I didn't raise it because it's a big can of worms, so we can talk about it later. So with our remaining minute, we believe energy efficiency is vital to long-term energy planning, and for these reasons listed, and we'd love to just remain a resource to your office and anything we can provide. I know we covered a lot, but we also covered a lot of things at a superficial level in some cases. So if there's any follow-up and ways in which we can provide additional detail or provide other resources or reports or anything, we would love to know how we can be helpful. And with that, we're available for questions. We will share this report. I also want to jump ahead to the next slide. We have an appendix of different cost effectiveness examples of IRPs in Indiana, Minnesota, and Michigan, which will be a part of this when we share it. I can stay a few minutes after, but I recognize a lot of other people may have a hard stop. So let us know if you have any questions. Happy to do that now.
I just want to say thank you very much. This was super informative and helpful. I'm glad I recorded it. I know there's others that couldn't join that want to watch it, and I also know that there's people on the call now that would even like to actually re-review it. The fuel switching and the electrification are hot topics. We've been trying to ignore them as long as we could and hope they would go away, but obviously we know we have to address them at some point, not because we're against it, but because we know it's going to be a really tough subject for us to deal with at this point. I also will be reaching out to you if anybody has questions, concerns, or my team has questions and concerns. I also may be reaching out to your team for some unbiased opinions on potential studies. We're having some conversations around that since we're getting ready to start our next statewide potential study, and I kind of think you might have a little bit of insight that might be able to be helpful to me and my team. So if anybody else has other questions, I'll let them chime in. It's 70 degrees here right now, so everybody probably just wants to get outside, but
Fair enough.
we can definitely let you know if we have questions or follow-up.
Yeah, please do. And just two other quick notes for folks. On electrification, Minnesota's Department of Commerce and their Public Utility Commission are doing a joint effort on a stakeholder process that was supposed to kick off earlier this year. They waited for legislation, then COVID hit. So they're putting together a technical advisory committee, which I hope to sit on and speak to some of those impacts and issues. And so we would share all of that with the rest of the region, including Michigan, who's probably like close to being next, where it's kind of bubbling up as a topic to think through, Illinois being the other. So happy to talk through that, not just fuel switching, but how does it fit in with energy efficiency, and where energy efficiency statutes and requirements designed to also allow electrification programs. So those questions are all to be answered, and it's all state specific and utility service territory specific in a lot of cases. The other thing I'll mention that I'm just blanking on, what was the last thing that you mentioned, Karen? I'm sorry.
Potential studies.
Yes, is Michigan, to my knowledge, is the only one that's doing these IRP statewide potential studies. And one note on that is in the 2017 run-up, right after the 2016 election, that run-up to the statewide assessment, potential study was done statewide, and there was a market assessment done as well on the CNI side. And I would love to have a conversation about, would it be appropriate to do one as almost the housing vintage study that the EWR team has been grappling with, or even affordable housing kind of assessment of what's out there for buildings and factoring some of that into potential
Okay.
just questions I'm asking rather than a directive or a advocate. So anyway,
that'd be great conversation.
Okay, well, we'll share the full deck as a PDF with you all, and thank you all for your time. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Nick.